what we might call gospel success, or moving people along that continuum until they cross some kind of a threshold. Either A, regularly attending church, check, or getting baptized, check. But there are lots of victories and successes along the way in ministering to people.
I'll tell you what, man. I love me some David Asscherick. Early in my Christian experience, 2010, I came across one of David Asscherick Bible prophecy series, Discoveries Prophecy, I think it's called. But I'll tell you what, man. It was a life transformation for me. It really was. When I sat down, I began to hear these truths. I went through 26 different studies, man. And my life has never been the same. It's never been the same. I admire the man. I think the man is amazing. His ability to speak is great. So in this video, David Asscherick is going to speak to us today about a number of things that happens in ministry that we need to consider. And oftentimes I struggle with this because I can start a Bible study with someone and I don't finish the study series, and sometimes the individual moves on to something else, moves on with somebody else, or sometimes they go to a different denomination, and sometimes I think, did I fail? Did I make a mistake? But David Asscherick's message helps me to actually understand, at the end of the day, we don't run the show. God has the final say. So I'm going to let him run and talk about this matter, and at the end, I'll come back and share a final thought and perspective so that we can always remember that God is the one who's in charge. He's going to use us where we can be used by him. Remember, we don't have the final say when it comes to every individual, and God takes everybody in a different journey. It doesn't always mean they're going to come through our doors in order for them to get into heaven. That's not always the case. And remember that there's a chain of command. Sometimes you just have to pass the baton of truth to the individual so that they can go to the next person to get in a segment of truth. And I think it's also good to keep that in mind. So David Asscherick's message is going to help tremendously as well. So let's take a listen.
Let's just put up the slide that we ended with yesterday. We're talking about bridges, not walls, how to speak to anyone about Jesus. And today we're going to go through as many of these stories as we can make time for. We'll talk about Ben. I'll talk to you about my strategy in speaking to Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll tell you a really great story of a lovely lady named Superna, a story of a guy named Kifa Muhammad, a young man named Joel, another young man named Brendan, and then Kate, the Pentecostal minister. Before we get into those individual stories, and I sort of model for you or give you instances, sometimes success stories, and I'll tell you a few sort of how I did things really wrong. And I'll just press pause on that. Years ago, I took a seminar that I traveled around and gave in quite a few places, and the seminar was basically similar to this, how to witness, how to be evangelistically intentional, etc. And part of that was I went through the 10 most common mistakes made by Christians in trying to communicate the gospel to other people, the 10 most common mistakes. Now, I'm not going to go through all 10 of those, but I'm going to tell you what the first mistake was. And I think it still holds true. I've seen it over and over again. And the most common mistake that's made by Christian people, followers of Jesus, who want to try and communicate their faith effectively to others is, are you ready for it? They don't make enough mistakes. Now, why do you think I might say that? That the most common mistake is that they're not making enough mistakes. Because they're not doing it enough to learn how to do it right? Because I use the illustration of learning to ride a unicycle, right? Learning to ride a bicycle is a comparatively easy task. Probably all of us in this room can ride a bicycle. Is there anybody in this room that can ride a unicycle? Like if we had one right here, you could ride it around this place? Any unicycle riders? Okay. Now, first of all, I think we can all admit that the sort of design of a unicycle is a bad one. Can we just say that it's a terrible design, right? But it does look kind of fun, and I've seen people ride unicycles, and it actually looks sort of interesting. In fact, several years ago at Arise, we had a young lady that brought a unicycle to Arise, and she left it sort of outside, and she said, hey, if anybody wants to try this, give it a go. Well, I consider myself a reasonably fit, reasonably athletic person, so I thought, well, I'm going to learn how to ride this thing. No, I'm not going to learn how to ride that thing. I tried it, and I went, dangerously fast forward, and I tried it again, and I went dangerously fast backward, and then finally I got two strong fellows on either side of me and tried to awkwardly pedal the thing forward, and I went back to the girl who's just like, she's just, she can do whatever she wants on the thing. It looks so almost graceful and easy, and I get on the thing, and I think, I could never ride this. And she said something very similar to me. She said, if you're going to want to ride a unicycle, you have to get on it hundreds and maybe thousands of times, and this is key, so your body starts learning all of the little things that are wrong, and then just by a process of deduction, when you've figured out all the ways to not do it, one time your body will say, hey, this is how you do it. And that's what happens with a lot of Christians in their witnessing to other people. They tried it once and it went really poorly. They tried it a second time and it went really poorly, and they said, I'll never learn to ride this thing. Right? They just gave up. And so a big part of learning to be an effective communicator of the gospel, whether a public situation like I'm in now or in a private, personal situation, is you're just going to have to make lots of mistakes. You're not going to hit a home run every time. You're not even going to get on base every time. You're going to make some really bad mistakes. You're going to say some things you wish you hadn't said. And once you learn through a series of making bad choices and saying the wrong thing and saying it in the wrong order and getting too argumentative or whatever your particular mistake might have been, you'll start to learn better how to do it right. Does that make sense? And so today I'll tell you some things that I've done pretty well, but this is after years of just learning how to interact with people in the name of Jesus. And I'll tell you a few stories, maybe a couple, where I just made some mistakes. I just said some things that actually closed down the conversation. Now, before we get into that, I want to walk you through what is sort of a rubric that I've come up with. It's a formula that I've come up with that, frankly, has been a game changer for me. And this is only the third or fourth time that I've presented this publicly. And I'm actually looking forward to writing a book about this at some point. So I'm going to share this with you, and hopefully you'll find this interesting. It's what I call the X to 10 fallacy. And the X to 10 fallacy looks something like this. You have kind of a continuum, and you can just imagine that from 1 to 10, you could use any number, of course, any spectrum of numbers, but we're going to use 1 to 10 here. And on the far left end, the 1, that's going to be people who are not just religiously disinterested, but religiously hostile. And on the far right end, a 10 is going to be whatever we consider the finish line to be. So in the case of most Seventh-day Adventist evangelists and evangelism, we think of a 10 as somebody becoming a baptized member of a local Seventh-day Adventist church, okay? Now, we could change the 10 slightly. We could say a committed follower of Jesus. We could say a Christian, whatever. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But just think, a 1 is religiously hostile. A 10 is committed. Religiously committed to Jesus Christ. Okay, so far so good. And then at every stage along the continuum, you have sort of different levels of interest in biblical Christianity. So a 2 would be maybe not hostile to religion, but totally indifferent. Completely indifferent, atheistic, no interest, thank you, but no thank you. Where a 1 is antagonistic, angry, upset, mad. Okay, then you get to maybe like a 3, and a 3 would be like an agnostic who doesn't think that Jesus was really anybody special. Maybe he was an historical figure, but yeah, no thank you, not interested. Okay, now you get to something like a 4, and a 4 might be somebody who's not themselves, they wouldn't identify as religious, they would probably identify as an agnostic, but they're open to the idea that there might be something out there, some sort of a God figure, some sort of meaning or purpose in the universe. By the time you get to 5, midway on the spectrum, this is somebody that, in my sort of creation of this idea, this rubric, is open to the idea that there is a force in the universe. They're even potentially open to the idea that that might be something resembling the Christian God, but they wouldn't identify as a Christian. These are the kinds of people that you might meet that would say, I'm spiritual, or I believe there's a purpose in the universe. You hear people talk this way. They'll say things like, the universe had something good in store for me. Have you ever heard that before? So they sense there's a purpose. They sense there's a sort of teleology to events, a kind of providence, but they wouldn't identify as a Christian, and they don't regularly attend church at all. Then you start to move toward the other end of the spectrum as we're getting closer to committed follower of Jesus and a 10, and you have somebody that's a 6. Maybe this person was raised in a Christian home, a Baptist home, a Nazarene home, a Seventh-day Adventist home, and they no longer practice Christianity, but they're sympathetic to Christianity. They might know some of the biblical stories. If you pressed them really hard, they'd say, yeah, I do believe there's a God, and it's probably the Christian God, but I'm non-committal. Right? We all, I think, know, probably many of us in this room know people like that. A 7 is just more of that, right? Maybe the person that's a 7 would be even open to attending church, maybe on Christmas or Easter or something like that. Open to religious things, maybe even occasionally, opens the Bible. 8, more interested still. 9, on the cusp of becoming a follower of Jesus. 10 is the finish line. Now, you can also plug in different religious affiliations there. So if you take like a Muslim, of course, is a committed monotheist, right? They believe in one God, and they also believe in large portions of the Old Testament. They would, of course, deny the divinity of Jesus, but somewhere on that continuum, they would be maybe something like a 6 or a 7, a committed Muslim. They're monotheistic, they believe there is a God, but they're not sympathetic to the teachings of Christianity. If you took somebody that was maybe like a conservative Hindu, they would be maybe closer to a 4 or a 3 on the spectrum, maybe a 5, depending on sort of their flavor of Hinduism. They're quite removed from the Christian end of the spectrum, but they are theistic, right? So you can just imagine everybody that you know would fit somewhere on this sort of imaginary spectrum of completely hostile to the Christian faith, all the way to, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, to crossing the finish line and becoming a committed follower of Jesus. So far, so good, everyone? So I would imagine that most of us in this room here today are 10s, right? Or there might be a few 9s in here, a few 8s. I suppose maybe there's somebody that got drugged here by their girlfriend or their boyfriend, and you're like, I'm a 4, that kind of a person. Okay, now the people that attend our churches are basically 9s and 10s, right? The people that regularly attend our churches are people who are either committed followers of Jesus or who are on the verge of becoming committed follower of Jesus, or they're in a prenuptial arrangement with somebody that they married. Okay, I'll go with you to church, I promise, right? I've got a few of those in my church. And they're there under compulsion, right? Captive audience. What I want to talk about, the X to 10 fallacy looks like this. The idea of the fallacy is that when we think of gospel success, think of somebody sitting in a conference office, a Ramiro Cano or a conference secretary. When they sit down to evaluate, by the way, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this, I'm just saying this is the way it is. When they sit down to evaluate a church's success or even a conference's success, they have very limited metrics to do this, right? Like a church's health would be evaluated by certain metrics, right? And the lowest hanging fruit of metrics would be things like baptisms, right? Like, how many baptisms did your church have this last year? Right? And the idea is that the more baptisms you had, the healthier your church is. That's not always true, but that's the idea, right? And so if you had a church, you had 0 baptisms last year, it's like, hey, that's not a good sign. And a conference secretary or a conference ministerial director or a conference president can sit in a room and read a piece of paper that has a printout of all the churches, the number of baptisms. You can also have other metrics like attendance. How many people? Oh, 220, then the next month was 219, then the next month was, you can look at, your average attendance. That's a metric. It's a helpful metric, but it doesn't really measure a lot when you think about the work that the Holy Spirit is doing in the world. Are you with me? I'm not saying these metrics are unimportant. They're meaningful. The number of baptisms in a local church or a local conference is a meaningful metric. The attendance in a local church is a meaningful metric. You with me? Tithe is a meaningful metric, but in terms of giving us a window into the work that the Holy Spirit is doing, as we've said in our Jonah series in the evening, that God is working with everyone, everywhere. Amen? Okay, so here's my point. We can't really easily measure what we might call gospel success or moving people along that continuum until they cross some kind of a threshold. Either A, regularly attending church, check, or getting baptized, check. But there are lots of victories and successes along the way in ministering to people. And we can fall into a trap of thinking that if we've not got somebody across some kind of imaginary finish line, that we've failed. We're not doing it right. We've made a mistake. And that's what I call the X to 10 fallacy. Just imagine that you have a neighbor. Okay, you've got a neighbor, and maybe you've lived next door to this person for 10 years, okay? And you've got a great relationship with them. You know the names of their children. You invite them over to your house, annually, maybe for the 4th of July, vegetarian barbecue. And you've maybe watched the Super Bowl together. You know one another's names. At one time, your weed eater wasn't working, so you needed to borrow their weed eater. And you've got a relationship with them. They're not your close friends, but you've got a good relationship with them. They're your neighbors. And let's say that over the course of your 10-year tenure living next door to your neighbors, when you first met them and they found out you were a Christian or a Seventh-day Adventist, they were really standoffish. They were like, that's not really my thing. And you sensed that there was some hostility there, or at least some indifference. And, if you were sort of imagining where they were on that spectrum, they were like a 4. Okay, they're not interested. That's not my thing. I'm not a church-going person. Wasn't raised that way. They're respectful of the fact that you go to church. Now, this is just an imaginary situation. But over the course of your 10 years together, some really interesting things have happened. One of them was diagnosed with cancer, and at one point, you were talking to them about it. They began to cry, and then you, in a moment of bravery, said, Margaret, I know that you're not a really religious person, but could I pray for you? And Margaret said, yes, would you please pray for me? Because she was afraid. She had breast cancer, and she let you pray for her. And then on another occasion, because you'd prayed with her, she let you know that, hey, I just want to let you know that our grandson has recently, had a terrible motorcycle accident, and he's had a spinal injury, and he might be paralyzed. Can you please pray for my grandson? Okay, now this is key. Over the course of your 10-year association with your neighbors, they never have become yet baptized members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They maybe have never even come to your church. Not only are they not members, they've never come, but they have been so favorably and positively impressed by your commitment to Jesus and by your Seventh-day Adventism that they have moved along that continuum from being hostile or maybe even antagonistic toward faith, maybe a 4, and now there's something closer to a 6 where they're actually open to the idea that there might be a God, and if they were ever going to go to a church, it would be your church. You with me on this sort of scenario here? Okay, now I'm going to ask you a question. Is that a meaningful movement along the continuum of that person's life toward becoming a follower of Jesus? Yes. So could we call that success? Yeah, we can easily call it success because you can just think of the reverse, right? Imagine that you had neighbors that you met them as like a 4, and you were such a cantankerous, obnoxious, forthcoming, overbearing person, and these people do exist, that they, at the end of your tenure of being their neighbors, they said, I'll tell you what, I would never be one of those people, and now they're like a 3, right? So that would be moving the wrong direction. That's not progress, that's regress, okay? So the idea here is basically this. You could never measure that at a conference office. Right? There's no form that Pastor Kano can sit down and say, wow, my church members in the Central California Conference are being effective neighbors to their neighbors and colleagues to their coworkers. And are you with me, yes or no? Okay, so now I'm going to go to the next slide here, if you would. Steve, I'm going to beep that. So here's what I'm saying. A 10, crossing the finish line and becoming a committed follower of Jesus, a baptized member, is the most measurable, but it's not the only meaningful metric of gospel success. If in your interaction with anybody, a brother-in-law, a neighbor, a colleague, a coworker, a child, if they move along the continuum from a 2 to a 3, or a 4 to a 5, or a 6 to a 7, in other words, if they have been favorably impressed about God and about Jesus by your witness and your words, you have to consider that as a giant victory.
I thought that was exceptionally amazing the way he put that. And again, I'm going to leave a link in the description below so that you can check out the rest of the message. I did not play everything on purpose because I want to give credit where credit is due to the YouTuber who posted this. This is good because oftentimes when we think about ministry, we oftentimes think in a way that is not always in line with God's ideal of ministry. And I do love taking a person from the beginning to all the way to the end, to see them being baptized and to see them engaged in the work of the Lord, to see them making disciples of others as well. But that's not always possible for every one of us, right? That's not always something God is going to have us to do. And it's okay to accept that and understand that you have a role to play in a person's life. And I can look at my own life and say, man, there were so many people who invested in me. It wasn't just one individual. So I shook hands and rubbed hands with so many other individuals in my life that they just boost me to the next level. Somebody boost me towards school. Somebody boost me toward Bible study. Somebody boost me toward baptism. Somebody else opened doors for me where I can preach. Others taught me how to pray. Some taught me how to love my wife better. Some taught me different things. It wasn't just one man who carried me. It really took a village to raise a Christian man. So I think this should be used as encouragement for those of you who are working in the vineyard of the Lord. Don't be discouraged. Continue to press on. Like I've said, I'm not going to do much preaching today. I just want to encourage you. Every time you put forth the effort to win souls for Jesus, it's never a waste. In the book of Isaiah, we are told, blessed is he who sows beside all waters. So the more you sow, the more you cast the gospel seed on the ground, in the hearts of men, God has a way of working tremendously. Sometimes you may be the individual who clothe the naked, who feed those who are hungry. You may not be always the person who's preaching. So you got to know your gift, your talent, your ministry, what God has ordained for you to do, and do it with all your heart and let him bless the rest of the effort. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say today. I don't want to spend any more time saying too much. I just wanted to share this video with you. Share your thought and perspective with me. I want to hear from you. Until next time, have a good one. Bye.